With such a long and incredible history dating back more than 100 years, the National Football League, or NFL, has more than its fair share of unique occurrences. But one of the quirkiest bits of history has got to be from the 1943 season, when two of the most famous franchises, both still in the league to this day, decided to become one, at least temporarily. Let's now talk about the last time football fans in Pennsylvania agreed on anything: the teams. We begin by outlining the two franchises involved in this historical oddity. First, the Pittsburgh Steelers, with their infamous black and gold uniforms. They were formed in 1933, making them the oldest franchise in the AFC Conference and the seventh oldest franchise in the NFL overall to this day. They've won 6 Super Bowl championships in their long history, as well as 8 conference championships and a whopping 24 divisional titles. This makes them one of the most successful franchises in NFL history. The team was founded by Art Rooney, and between him and his family, they have actually had a controlling interest in the club for almost its entire history. This is an absolutely wild sports fact on its own, given how often clubs have changed hands over the decades. With 18 Steelers players, coaches, or administrators having been enshrined in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, it's a team with a legacy of success. And sharing the state of Pennsylvania with the Pittsburgh Steelers, and thus creating an enormous rivalry, are the Philadelphia Eagles, located just 305 miles or around 490 kilometers away. Like the Steelers, the Eagles were formed in 1933, giving them an equally long history, and also like the Steelers, this team has had its fair share of success over the years. They've won 5 conference championships and 15 divisional titles, along with 4 overall league titles. They most recently appeared in the 2022 Super Bowl, narrowly losing out to the Kansas City Chiefs in a thriller of a game. So we've got 2 historic and proud franchises, a heated rivalry, and a legacy of success. So what on earth could make these 2 teams form into one? In short, it was war. World War II. With the entry of the United States into the Second World War in 1941, following the infamous bombing of Pearl Harbor, the pool of available men for the war machine needed to be tapped, and tapped in a big way. And while this was a great thing for the US military and related industries, it was not great for things like professional sports. Since the demographic of football players in the United States was young, physically fit men who excelled under challenging conditions and knew how to perform both as individuals and within a team, it's not surprising that NFL rosters were decimated by the war. Indeed, it is estimated that around 600 NFL players joined the armed forces in some capacity, which is an astoundingly high number. A similar story played out in other major American sports such as baseball, basketball, and ice hockey. But though the teams were being drained of their talents, the industry of sports really needed to go on. And in fact, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt was super keen that sports continue, firmly aware that pastimes like this were a welcome distraction and morale boost for the population during wartime. So it was decided that the 1943 NFL season would go ahead, following the league of Major League Baseball for their season. But fielding even a half-decent team was going to be incredibly difficult. Wild ideas were needed, and so began one of the most incredible teams in NFL history: the Steagles. For the upcoming 1943 season, the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Philadelphia Eagles were in trouble. Following voluntary enrollments as well as the military draft of that year, the Eagles had only 16 players under contract for the season, while the Steelers were in even worse shape with only 6 players. And finding more players was going to be really tough, partially because anyone of playing age was probably headed to war, and partially because the league didn't allow black players, but that's a whole other story. Steelers owner Art Rooney had a crazy idea. Let's merge my Steelers with the nearby Philadelphia Eagles. The owner of the Eagles at the time was this guy named Alexis Thompson, who, by the way, was a corporal in the US Army at this point. He wasn't initially keen on the idea, but given his background with Rooney, as well as the fact that he was, kind of busy in the Army, he eventually agreed. They were officially known as the Phil Pitt Combine, and NFL records display them as this, but they ended up being affectionately known as the Steagles, and this is just objectively a way better name. Now that the two had merged into one, a roster needed to be built out to actually field a team. Since effectively all able-bodied men were in the military, the folks who they could sign to the team generally were exempted from service due to some sort of physical limitation. This is quite obviously not ideal for a professional football team, but they didn't have many choices, and so they turned to some rather unorthodox player options. Tony Bova, who would end up being their leading receiver in 1943, was blind in one eye and partially blind in the other. Their guard, Ed Michaels, was nearly deaf, and their center, Ray Graves, was deaf in one ear. And the guy who did their place kicking and punting, that was a guy named Troy Smith, and he had a prosthetic leg. I am not making that up. But they were a team. They were a real football team, and it was time to take the field. Hopes were probably not all that high for the 1943 season, but nonetheless, there were more than a few surprises yet to come. The 1943 season. In their first exhibition game against the mighty Green Bay Packers on September 11th, the Steagles fell by a final score of 28-10. This was followed up by another loss on September 16th to the Chicago Bears, this time by a score of 20-7. With only 2 exhibition games on the schedule, this was all the Steagles would get for a warm-up. The season was not off to an ideal start, and let's be serious, folks were probably not all that optimistic. But all of that bad mojo was gone when they opened the season on October 2nd against the Brooklyn Dodgers. Not the baseball team. There was actually an NFL team by that name too, fun fact. Not only did the Steagles win this game, they won in a shutout, final score 17-0. And to make it even more remarkable, they held their opponents to minus 33 rushing yards. Yeah, a net loss in rushing yards. To this day, it ranks as the 3rd lowest rushing output by an NFL team in a game in history. I think people assumed these guys were going to break some records, but not in a good way. But despite this strong start to the regular season, the second game against the New York Giants looked to be a regression to the mean. The Steagles set an NFL record by fumbling the ball 10 times in this game, a mark which has never been broken since. But somehow, fate intervened, and despite these fumbles, they scored 3 fourth-quarter touchdowns to come back and win 28-14. A 2-0 start to the season for the Steagles. Incredible. But as you can imagine, all good things must come to an end, and they would come back down to earth from there, dropping Game 3 against the Chicago Bears. But the season overall was far better than most expected, as they finished the year with a record of 5 wins, 4 losses, and 1 tie. It wasn't enough to win any championships, of course, but it was more than enough to win a boatload of respect. And for many of these players, barred from serving in the military, it was their chance to achieve something on the home front. And it's kind of a massive irony that the same physical limitations that kept them from contributing abroad allowed them to instead contribute at home. The legacy of the Steagles. Even though 1943 was the only season of the Steagles, it's not actually fully the end of the story. Though the NFL was on much more solid footing starting in 1944, as more players were available because the US military decided it had enough troops, expansion had left the league with 11 teams, which was a scheduling nightmare. And the NFL actually asked for the teams to stay merged, as 10 teams made more sense than 11. Art Rooney and his Pittsburgh Steelers still had big-time problems, so they were all for it. However, Philadelphia refused, so Pittsburgh instead merged with a team called the Chicago Cardinals for the 1944 season. This new merged team was referred to as Card Pit, combining the 2 team names, but they were destined to be known as Carpet, because every other team walked all over them, and they went winless that season. By the time the 1945 season rolled around, the war had ended and the league was reorganized back to 10 teams, so no more mergers were required. It was a return to business as usual, and this certainly seemed to suit the Philadelphia Eagles just fine, as they went on to win back-to-back NFL championships shortly thereafter. But for as long as there will be professional football in America, its history will always remember the brief moment in time that 2 storied franchises became one, and when the most unlikely group of players came together to form the most unlikely of teams. That's it for the video today, folks. Let me know what you think in the comments, and as always, if you have ideas for future videos, fire them off, drop them in there, and I'll see what I can do. Take care of yourselves, and talk again soon.